Hey, this is Stephen Klein, and this is Paige Clark with Healthy Fit Club, and we have a great special guest today, Dr. Zach Bush, who I'd heard a lot about, and so I've been dying to meet you. Anyway, Paige, as always, has a great background in health and nutrition, and has had me on your product for a long time. And then one of my really good friends, and this is a good intro, probably the smartest guy that I know, Robbie Bessner, said, you've got to talk to Dr. Zach Bush because he's the smartest guy that I know.
No, yeah.
And what was interesting was I thought I'd see this guy like 75 years old, looked like Einstein, and here you are, like child prodigy guy. You're probably your late 30s or early 40s, I guess, right? So thank you.
I wish that was true, but I'm going to go with that. I'm going to say, yeah, late 30s. I'll embrace that.
That's right. He can be your new best friend today. That's what I'm going to say.
He's just trying to score points right now.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Bush. Everybody's starting to hear the big buzzword about gut health being a big thing, and obviously it wasn't too long ago that wasn't a buzzword at all. So
before we get into it,
yeah.
For our listeners who don't know, like we know that he's the bomb.
Oh,
I
yeah,
want to tell you a little bit about
sure.
Dr. Zach Bush. Dr. Bush was president of the medical school class at the University of Colorado Health Science Center with an MD, and he later became chief resident for the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Virginia, very close to my home, my heritage. And so over the last 12 years, he's continued to further his medical and basic science knowledge, and he's among a few of the physicians in the nation that is triple board certified. So folks, you can leave it to Healthy Fit Club. We're going to find the people that know what they're talking about.
That's right.
And he's completed training and certification in 3 fields, including internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism. And he's been involved in hospice and palliative care, which is very important. We're just thrilled to be here. He's published many peer-reviewed articles and areas of expertise in the areas of infectious disease, endocrinology, cancer, gut health. And in his own clinic, his revolutionary clinic, he's really helping people reach what we're so passionate about, which is optimal health and peak performance. And he's seen clinically significant improvements in his patients, helping them with what we're hearing now, leaky gut syndrome, helping them restore gut health, because as goes the gut, goes a lot of other things, right, Dr. Zach Bush?
That's right. Dr. Zach works.
And so I think today we could talk to you for hours upon hours. In fact, we hope we can eventually. But I think we really want to drill down, because what we're seeing and hearing is the microbiome and the gut and leaky gut. And we want our listeners to hear it from a triple board certified doctor. Why should we be concerned about the gut health?
Yeah, and how do we get maximum, optimal health in the gut, and that whole gut-brain connection and all that. So to start off, and you can kind of lead this however you want to go, Dr. Bush, but a couple things in watching, looking over some of the information on your website, you've got a phenomenal product we definitely want to talk about for optimal gut health. But the one thing that kept coming up, or is that you even said on one of the webinars, with chronic inflammation is the loss of communication at the cellular level, and that most people aren't aware that inflammation that arises in all different parts of the body is coming from poor gut health. And so are a lot of other maladies or ailments that people may never even look to that, and that's turning out to be a big cause of problems. So if you can kind of tell us, or are you tapping me? Go ahead. Yeah, just if you can kind of start coming on that, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, we'll dive in right there. I think that's a good starting point. Just to give a little bit of perspective to everybody listening in, there's 2 types of inflammation that are often not talked about, even at the medical level, let alone at kind of more the consumer level. But there's acute inflammation, which is really life-saving and really extends life. And so when we're talking about optimal performance, if all of us could maintain in an environment where we could have injury and acute inflammation response, we would live forever. It's this real process of injury and regeneration that happens through the acute inflammatory process that's really life-giving and life-extending. So I don't want you to walk away thinking all inflammation is bad, because in fact, that acute inflammatory reaction and the body's response to that injury is exactly what helps you survive a day of your life, let alone a long lifetime. So acute inflammation, very good. And then as mentioned here, chronic inflammation, whole different ballpark. And we could talk about, all number of epidemics that we're currently facing in the world, and we could tie it back to this concept of shift from acute inflammation to chronic inflammation. And really what's happening as you transition between those two worlds of acute inflammation to the chronic state is you're running out of a reservoir. You're running out of coping mechanisms at the cell level. And so if you picture now for a moment that you're walking around with kind of a reservoir that you could maybe perhaps like hold in your hands, and you're walking around with this reservoir of coping mechanisms, and every time you get an injury, you absorb some of those coping mechanisms. Well, if you pile on so much injury that you can't keep up, then you eventually, as the reservoir dries up, you switch into chronic inflammation, which is now the body's just dumping immune response without any of the checks and balances, without that reservoir of antioxidants and pro-inflammatory checkpoints and all of these things that are supposed to be in the mix. And so it's really this drying up of coping mechanisms that's happening at the cell level.
I think when you say that, Dr. Bush,
yeah,
immediately I felt like we could take two words and exchange them. You're talking about inflammation and stress. You know, acute stress, we need to have that ability to react to the saber-toothed tiger.
Yes.
Chronic stress breaks down our reservoirs, so I can see where they go hand in hand.
In fact, those are so hand in hand that at the biology level, we use those two interchangeably. And so chronic stress or oxidative stress is the same as chronic inflammation at the cell level. So you're spot on. You're spot on that there's this relationship between any stressor, whether it's psychological, spiritual, physiologic, environmental, all of these stressors come in, and they're ultimately, if overwhelming the system, they're going to turn into this chronic inflammatory state.
Gotcha.
So, as Stephen was mentioning there, we got this situation where if you've got a switch from communication to a lack of communication. And that's really this interesting phenomenon that we've really settled on as a group, is that if you have enough vocabulary in play, if you've got all of this wireless communication up and running, you really have an infinite capacity to respond to that acute inflammatory challenge. And so it's not until you start to run out of the cellular communication that you start to run into the accumulation of damage there.
So we can say a Tower of Babel is happening in our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. You've got all of this bizarre signaling, and nobody's talking the same language. So a good.
That's a pageism. I always have to put in the little snigglets here.
Well, I like those snigglets, and I like the word sniglet, so I'm going to steal that from you as well. We can picture for a moment just the cell phones, and so your cell phone is a computer that works all the time. It's got all the machinery in there to receive and send messages, and it works all the time. However, if you're more than 7 miles from the nearest cell phone tower, there's no communication happening.
Right.
If you stay out of touch with that wireless communication long enough, you know what happens to your cell phone. The programs don't update. They start to accumulate dysfunction. They're not defragmenting themselves. And so you start to get a more and more dysfunctional operating system in your cell phone or your computer. And so that's why we're always kind of linking back, and your computer's always asking you, update now. Well, what the computer is literally trying to do is reconnect to the original information or new information and update, defragment, correct all of the communication internally. And so it's the same thing with your cells. As you start to lose that wireless signal, you start to get fragmented, you start to lose the smooth flow of information through the system, and you stop repairing.
So can you talk a little bit about the magnitude of the gut biome? When I started looking at that on your site and doing a little research, again, I'm not as versed as Paige, I was blown away. They were talking about quadrillion cells, 30,000 species of biome.
We're more microbiome than we are our own human cells.
Yeah, that part.
So you can only imagine what's going on if our own cellular communication, but then those cells communicating. Yeah, give us
And through antibiotics and antiseptics and all the things people are using to try to clear out what they think everything is bad, it, I guess, takes out the good, and that's
interfering with the cellular communication that he explains so well.
Yeah, so if you can school us on that, Dr. Bush, that'd be great. So that's that whole gut biome thing and how big it is and what an influence it has on our health and overall makeup.
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers are so grand that it's pretty difficult to wrap the human mind around, just because we're not exposed to these kinds of numbers very often. But so if we start at the lower numbers, you have 25,000 genes on the generous side. That's probably closer now to an estimate of 22 or 23,000 genes. Those genes then make lots of different proteins, some 200,000 proteins that will build a human body. That human body will be composed of 70 trillion cells.
Wow.
70 trillion cells at the human level is an extraordinary number. That's roughly 3 times our national debt. So it's not too far outside of our daily experience of like, okay, the U.S. is in debt by some $18 trillion or something like that. So, all right, so that's a lot of zeros, but we could say, okay, that's 1,000 billion is a trillion. And so you can imagine in a government building up a $1 trillion debt, not so hard. Now you say, okay, well, that's 70 American debts or 18 trillion, your 3 or 4 American debts worth of cells. Now you have to make that leap again. 1,000 trillion is a quadrillion, and that quadrillion is now approaching the biome number. And so it's around 1.5 quadrillion or 1,500 trillion cells make up this incredible ecosystem of your gut and skin flora. And so when we talk about the microbiome, it's not limited to your intestines, although that's probably where 85% of it dwells. You have flora underneath your eyelids, on the surface of your eye, your nasosinuses, through your lungs, all over your skin. There's vaginal flora that's very unique. There's, flora in the prostate, in the human breast. It turns out there's just bacteria everywhere. And that huge population of 1.5 quadrillion is unfortunately yet again, or maybe very fortunately, outnumbered logarithmically again by some other entity in your body called mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the energy factory that runs the translation of food on your plate into fuel for your cells. And so first the bacteria take care of all that food. They then metabolize that down to macronutrients and micronutrients that they get fed to your mitochondria, which take all those macronutrients, the fat and the sugar, and turn them into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the fuel the human cell runs on. And so
brilliant.
There's 1.4 or 1.5 quadrillion bacteria, and there's 10 times that many mitochondria. So you're somewhere around 14 quadrillion mitochondria. So if you look at 14 quadrillion plus 1.5 quadrillion, you're somewhere around 15, 16 quadrillion cells, and you're not even talking about a human cell yet. And so if you look at those numbers, we're barely 1 or 2% human with this incredible machine that we carry around.
Might as well go home. let them run the party. It's kind of like we're a log with all the, everything else is going on, and we're just there as a host.
And along those lines, you can imagine how frustrating it is to be a doctor, get trained for 17 years and all these different silly subspecialties and everything else, and you carry all of this knowledge with you to find out that half-truths about maybe 1/2 of the physiology of less than 1% of the entire system that we would call human life. And so
that was a goosebump comment, what you just said. Yeah. I mean,
well, for you it's goosebumps. For me it was major depression, but
right, I can see that. And because I think that you're not alone in that, Dr. Bush. So many medical doctors today are waking up to the fact that they really begin their training in medicine, so to speak, once they actually get out of the schools and learning, and then they learn and they do wonderful things like some of the things that we're going to learn you've been doing. So
no, it's really true. I think the best way to learn is to be right in the midst of a real system, and everything we learn in a petri dish is limited, and so our current modern day understanding of cardiac physiology or cancer physiology or any of these different general concepts of how disorder happens or how disorder is reversed has all really been learned in petri dishes of human cells, devoid of the bacteria, with almost no respect to the mitochondria. And so we've got this huge disconnect between the reality that we're living every day and the medicine that we practice. And so that's why we've been so unsuccessful in Western medicine. Humans have never been sicker than the last 100 years. And so the $3 trillion a year that we spend on medical care in this country is going to have to fall short, because we keep targeting this little 1% of the physiology, and we don't even target it for health. We target it for disease management, right? And so we are just so far from any sort of foundation that would elucidate or bring about some sort of enlightenment of health as a healthcare industry. So huge misnomers within that industry and everything else, but it's people like you that are really pushing the paradigm, because ultimately the consumer has had to stop going to their doctor for the information on how to, and start going to the real source of information, which is this really unbridled source of the internet. And you guys have this powerful voice to say, let's bring together the voices that are speaking to this issue of optimal performance. How do we get to that? And so kudos to you guys for being part of that incredible public
as you know, the new healthcare is self-care, and learning is a big part of it. You know, the word doctor originally meant teacher.
Yes, we need to come back to that, right?
The medical group kind of co-opted that word and turned it into something different, and somehow or another the teaching has gotten out of medicine, and it's people like you that are practicing your medicine and then bringing, you know, amazing information about how it really works out of that 1%, and how we're really running with all these other microorganisms. It's going to change medicine today.
Yeah, and so in talking, before we just talk about optimal gut health, can you talk a little bit about how the gut degrades, what causes those things? You talk a lot about tight junctions and zonulin. Is that how you say it?
Well, zonulin is a compound that happens, I believe, when from gliadin, and then it starts, but it goes beyond that. He'll probably explain it all to us.
Sure, Dr. Bush.
Well, in other words, how does the microbiome in the gut start to get damaged? Just start with gut damage 101.
Yeah, so we can, I want you to know that I wasn't smart enough to come up with all this on my own. Dr. John Gilday is a PhD from the University of Virginia who's done a lot of our science around the tight junctions. Brilliant scientist, and will likely win the Nobel Prize for some of the stuff he's elucidated over the last few years. But so he's been a huge piece of my understanding of the gut and how gut health happens. And further than that, I want to also emphasize that none of us, including him, were smart enough to figure out all this out prospectively. All of the great discoveries that happen in medicine are usually by accident, and we would definitely include ourselves in that. And so in 2012, we started to realize there was a relationship between, like you were referring to there, the microbiome and the bacteria and what they were doing, and this issue of gut permeability, or the amount of protection your gut lining is able to afford you. And what we've been able to retrospectively figure out over the last 5 years, working with our patients and in the basic science labs, under the microscopes, et cetera, and in our own bodies, frankly, we've been able to piece this whole story back together retrospectively. And the story goes really around the wireless communication network that we started with. At the biology level, this wireless communication network is a family of molecules that we refer to as redox molecules. And the word redox is a combination of the word reduction and oxidation. Loosely speaking, reduction is the contribution of an electron, and oxidation is the absorption or taking away of an electron. And so there is this really neat kind of dominoes effect that happens down at the cell tissue level, that if you throw an electron out there, it can be either passed on or absorbed by a reductant or an oxidant. And it's this chain flow or domino flow effect of electrons at the tissue level that become that wireless communication. Every cell has all of the machinery to do cell maintenance and repair all day long. But if it's not getting enough of those electrical signals through, we start to break down. So my area of expertise historically was in cancer, and so I was doing cancer research at the University of Virginia, and I was specializing in some of this redox signaling. And at that time, my entire understanding and the understanding of the whole field was that these molecules are all made by the mitochondria. There was one of the many of these, so dozens and dozens of these redox molecules. One of them was made by the human cells, and that was nitric oxide, which was actually the first redox molecule discovered in the early 90s.
Right.
And so that nitric oxide is the only one that we make in the human cell level, and it's released during exercise. We could have a whole talk on the importance of exercise and human physiology. But obviously, that one being important, it's dwarfed by the number that are made by the mitochondria, which are these little non-human guys that live inside your cells and make energy. And so they're byproduct of the breakdown or metabolism of fat and sugar down to your ATP fuel. The side products of that, or metabolites, are these little redox molecules that set up this cell-cell signaling environment. And they dictate everything from cell repair to cell suicide. So if the cell is too damaged to repair and is turning into a cancer cell, it can induce this apoptosis or suicide event where the cell just kills itself so that it can get out of the way and allow the body to regenerate and go about its business. And so the redox molecules were really the hallmark of my work at UVA, and really an exciting new paradigm of cancer understanding at the time. Fast forward now, when I left the University of Virginia and started a nutrition center, feeding people tons of healthy food to try to shift their microbiome. We were starting to understand the relationship between microbiome and chronic health problems. And we were kind of making those connections. But what we were finding is that there was a lot of people, at least a third, if not half, that when we fed them health food, fed them green smoothies and kale juices and everything else, they were actually getting worse, not better. Their inflammatory markers were getting worse. They were feeling worse, more bloating, more fatigue, more brain fog. And so we had to start asking questions about the science we were practicing in the nutrition world and saying, is there something wrong with the food itself? Is there something that's happened to the kale that's made it not the same as the kale in the 1980s when all this science was created? And that's when we started to ask questions about the soil. And I had never honestly thought about soil and its direct impact on human health. And now that's all we do as a science group. But at that moment in 2012, we simply asked that question, is there something wrong with the soil now that didn't pre-exist in the 1980s when we're doing all this nutrition science? And what we found, we were going through a 90-page white paper on soil science. William Vitalis was my colleague who brought in that paper. And on page 40-ish of that paper, flipping through, there's suddenly a huge molecule that had all this carbon backbone on it that I had never seen before in the biologic system, and then this huge cluster of molecules that clearly had redox potential on it. And so it rang true with, oh my gosh, that kind of looks like the redox stuff I was doing at UVA. Why is that in soil? How did it get there? And so that's when we really delved into, oh my gosh, people have been looking to the herbs and the plants and for medicine since the beginning of time. But how few times have we looked to the soil itself for a direct medicine for the human? And so we finally kind of made this connection for ourselves of like, oh my gosh, there is not only potential medicine in the soil, there's a communication network sitting in that soil. Why is it there? And that's when we made the simple connection of, oh my gosh, the bacteria must be talking. And to this day, out in the literature, you don't find much discussion on this issue of bacterial crosstalk. But it has to be there, because if we have a system of 30,000 species at 1.5 quadrillion total number, how important would communication be in that society? And so the bacteria have this fluent communication network that we kind of cracked the code on, or at least began that process in 2012. And coming out of that now has been the soil product that we've used for years now in the clinic and has now become a kind of an international phenomenon, which is this soil extract that are bacteria talking and fungi talking, and this whole microbiome from the soil cross-talking back and forth. It's interesting to note that extraction process that we're doing is 50 million years old. And so we could not find topsoil on the earth right now that's thriving as it should. We have a very chemicalized food chain. We have a chemicalized farming industry, and it's really damaged the microbiome in soil. And we have a very narrow ecosystem. And so if you go back in the fossil record, though you can find ecosystems that now are dead, there's no more bacteria or fungi alive, but their communication network is there. And that's the difference between these carbon-based redox signaling molecules that we found in 2012 and the oxygen-based ones that mitochondria make. Those ones that come out of the mitochondria, they last about a millionth of a second, especially if you take them outside of a cell. Very effervescent. However, this big carbon backbone that the bacteria have to make to stabilize their redox signaling environment so that they can talk across very adverse situations. So think about the bacteria in your mouth versus the bacteria in your stomach versus that in your colon. You're talking about a pH of 7, 2.8 or 3.2 back to 7 in this much space. And so those bacteria, if they're going to talk across that thing, are going to have to somehow build a carbon backbone that's going to be stable and carry that redox potential through adversity. And so that's the really unique opportunity. When we saw that in soil, we were like, oh my gosh, that has redox potential and it should be stable. We should be able to pull that out of the fossil record and get that redox signaling back into play. And there's a few tricks we have to do to pull that oxygen-hydrogen reactivity back into that environment, but it is doable. We proved that in 2012, 2013, and now we've been getting to see what that intelligence of that wireless communication system does when it gets back into the intestinal environment.
Wow.
I mean, and the way you explained it, I'm able to actually visualize that. And I know that our listeners are just going to have an aha moment. They'll probably have to replay and really absorb this, because this is huge. Because what you're really saying is we can eat all the healthy food, but because the soil is not what it was, its wireless network has been wiped out in today's terms, due to this monoculture, agriculture type of things we've done and the chemicals we put on them. And yet there is a way to, as you found through your research, to reestablish, relocate that communication network and get it so that we can reintroduce it to our microbiome.
Yeah.
And the exciting thing is that that we weren't necessarily expecting is that is an interspecies communication network. And so it's not only getting your bacteria to talk to the bacteria in your gut again, it's actually the bacteria start talking to the mitochondria. And so we've shown that bacterial communication network immediately talks to mitochondria, and the mitochondria changes their behavior. And so it's so cool now to realize, whoa, we are being nursemated. The mere 70 trillion human cells are being taken care of by these huge populations of non-human cells that are taking care of you. They love you and are nurturing you and are literally providing the wireless communication for seamless repair, seamless and endless regeneration, acute inflammation, acute repair, back to homeostasis, injury, acute inflammation, homeostasis, repair. That is being taken care of. That is being moderated and mediated by the bacterial biome and those mitochondria that you inherited from your mom. You inherited it not from mom's cells. You inherited it from her vaginal canal. You inherited it with all her bacteria. You inherited it from her breast, suckling on that breast. So you were gifted the second birth. You had your genetic conception with your mom and dad's genes, and then you had this 10-fold increase, 100-fold increase, 1,000-fold increase of inheritance from mom. And so as a male doing this science, you start to wonder if we're almost superfluous to the survival. It's like we are good for a very important moment, and then it's all mom.
Yeah. It was just Mother's Day, so we'll.
Yeah, so hats off to all of the moms and all you do.
On your side, even being birthed via C-section instead of coming through the vaginal canal, that robs you of a whole bunch of biome that
sure does.
Beneficial coming out as well.
Just to segue a little bit, my second grandbaby, my first grandbaby, everything went well, birthing center. Second child, my daughter had placenta previa. Very disappointing because she was such a great natural birth mom. But we actually prepared gauze in her vagina and then swabbed the baby all over his eyes, his mouth, his face, his ears. We just wiped it everywhere as if he had come out of the vaginal canal. So
perfect.
Awesome.
I wish I had known that, earlier to share with people, but I'm very passionate about helping to educate a lot of these young people how important this nursing and this normal natural delivery and birthing. So thanks for sharing that.
So Dr. Bush, so the breakdown of, the tight junctions and the things that lead to disrepair, is that caused from the removal of or just the lack of health of the good bacteria and the takeover from the bad bacteria? What causes that imbalance or the breakdown of the tight junction to begin with?
Perfect. Yeah. So, if we look now back at the soil over the last 80 years and say, what took us from this rich ecosystem that had almost an unlimited capacity for communication? What changed? And what changed was our farming industry. And so coming out of World War II, there was a huge glut of petroleum because the war machine had settled down. We had revved up the petroleum industry to levels never seen in human history to fuel that war machine, all the ships and the jeeps and everything else worldwide. Suddenly that demand dried up, and so there was this huge, rich opportunity to redirect that petroleum industry. And so it got redirected into what we call the petroleum-based fertilizers.
NPK.
Yeah. And so the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium that was in there, the NPK, those three elements became, extracted easily from that oil, and they became the new process of farming. Well, of course, that's what's lacking in the NPK is the other 1 million important things for a healthy plant, right? But
right.
Okay, unfortunately, all those trace minerals and essential amino acids and all kinds of stuff that should be in there. But unfortunately, that grows a green plant. And so because the plants looked green and were healthy and were growing vibrantly, we figured out how to farm much more efficiently. And suddenly we went from 100-acre farms to 10,000, now 100,000-acre farms, because it got so efficient just to dump a bunch of chemical there instead of taking care of the soil and crop rotation and really nurturing that soil biome and taking care of the composting and all of that stuff that was thousands of years old of human practice suddenly dried up. And so we started by the 1950s and 60s seeing a lot of food introduced to the food chain that were lacking nutrients. And when you lack nutrients, you lack the need for bacteria to deal with those nutrients. And so when we start to create a monoculture in the fields, we immediately have a reciprocal monoculture develop in our gut, where this rich biome of 30,000 species suddenly only needs to be 3,000 species because we have so few nutrients going into the system. And so by the 1970s and 80s, we were starting to become very vulnerable at the gut lining. We didn't know it at the time. Nobody was focused on tight junctions and gut permeability or anything like this at the time. But little to our knowledge, we had developed a huge vulnerability in the intestinal wall because we had lost the wireless communication that would have been made by this rich biome.
Wow.
With that vulnerability, then we started, throwing on top of that farming industry antibiotics. And so the antibiotic industry exploded from 1945 to 2005. And we've been pretty flat in our prescription patterns as physicians in the last 12 years. But through that process, we went from kind of everybody getting an occasional dose of antibiotic to currently in 2012, for example, a study that came out showed that this study is actually, you can find on in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the study shows that there was 833 antibiotic prescriptions, 833 per 1,000 persons in the United States every year.
Yeah.
So 83% of the population by number is getting exposed to some sort of antibiotic in a given year. Wow. That's an extraordinary destruction of the biome right there. So not only is your food not giving you it, not only are you not touching your soil anymore, you outsourced your farming. You're not touching your soil anymore. You're not growing your plants. You're not pulling your own weeds. So you're not exposed to the biome. Then you're not eating food that would challenge that biome to a complexity. And then suddenly you add the antibiotic air on top of it, and now we're walking around with a fraction of what we would have had 100 years ago. That led to this situation where we had a complete breakdown in cell-cell communication, which of course makes us prone from this shift of acute inflammation to chronic inflammation. And lo and behold, by the 1980s and then certainly into the 90s and blowing up in the 2000s, all the epidemics we see today in children, adults, etc. And so we became vulnerable through this loss of respect and loss of care for the ecosystem. And then on top of that, we added a chemical to our food chain that would be the perfect destruction to the Velcro. And so the tight junctions that you mentioned are really the Velcro that will hold one cell to another cell. And that membrane that is your gut is the largest in your body. And so this is why when we say gut health is important, you now can't pick up a single medical journal in any specialty that's not talking about the gut in some shape or form. We now know that cardiovascular or cancer or whatever this topic, it's all going to tie back to gut health because it's this transition from acute inflammation to chronic inflammation that is the hallmark of disorder. It is the hallmark of shift from optimal health to the degradation of it. So to stay in this optimal health environment, what we have proven over and over again over the last 5 years now is if you have enough communication, you're going to be resilient. And you're even going to be resilient to this chemical that we added to the food chain, and that chemical is glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup historically, but Roundup came off of patent. It's a weed killer. You've seen it on the shelves of Lowe's and Home Depot and everything else. But that compound glyphosate went off patent in 2007, and now glyphosate is the active ingredient in every weed killer on the market pretty much.
So they're all horrible.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
I had no idea about that, or the fact that I think I read on your site that 60%, or I heard in a webinar that 60% of the glyphosate is really low-grade glyphosate coming out of China.
Yes.
Everything, that we're not even the big creators of it, or Monsanto's not necessarily the bad guy anymore because it's off patent, and now it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it definitely, now there's a free trade agreement between China and Australia. And so as soon as China started making this huge volume of cheap glyphosate, they dumped it into the industry, pennies on the dollar, to Australia. And now Australia is way ahead of us in a lot of the childhood disorders. So,
for sure.
the U.S. is distraught, but we're seeing other countries start catching up as this cheap glyphosate gets infiltrated into the food chain.
And I've been noticing a lot of Stephanie Seneff out of MIT. I've had opportunity to meet with her. We're involved in a lot of groups together. I mean, she's done a lot to explain that how it's really interfering with the glycine and the cell receptors and the sulfation. I mean, it's a crazy thing that I just can't believe we're allowing to destroy our health.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary, and the extent of the industry has become pretty dumbfounding. And obviously, the genetically modified science, the GMO science, is really the whole reason they put GMO on the market was to sell more Roundup. So those were originally called Roundup Ready crops, and the whole purpose was so they could start spraying whole crops instead of just the weeds with their weed killer. And so, that 1996 introduction of the GMO corn and then soybean, it took over the industry so fast. Nobody in 1996 thought that by 2005 we'd be growing 85% of our soybean, and now over 95% of our soybean as GMO, and some 85% of our corn crop is GMO. And so nobody really saw the speed at which that was going to happen. And of course, there was a lot of nefarious things that happened. Monsanto was suing farmers who were refusing to use theirs. I mean, it was just a real insidious, weird business plan that they had that unfolded that quickly. But all that pressure and all of that is really, it's easy to turn this into a whistleblower kind of, red flag, there's conspiracy theory. But in reality, we as consumers created this problem. We outsourced our own weeding and we outsourced our own crop production. And so the very good news about that is we are the problem and we are the solution.
There you go.
So we can talk about Monsanto and their problems, and they're selling to Bayer, and Bayer is a German company. I mean, there's all kinds of geopolitical freak out that we could do. But in reality, we're the solution. We were part of the problem. And now let's just reverse engineer this food chain back to where we were in the 1940s in a lot of ways, right?
Take control.
Yeah, so when you talk about taking responsibility, so first, of everything you talked about, it makes it sound like just about every ailment could have a root in gut health. So when people are trying to go on some kind of treatment protocol, they're not going to have success because they're not treating, the root cause.
Yeah.
So when we realizing that, then what do we do for optimal health? And of course, Paige, as I told you, I really respect her viewpoints on the best supplementation out there, or real food.
Or foods,
she would say.
Lifestyle.
And so I've been taking the Restore product for probably almost a year now. But can you speak a little bit now, I guess, to that optimal gut health? What do you do with the breakdown of the soil and the fact that there's glyphosate everywhere? What do you do to improve your gut health and have that optimal health in the gut?
Yeah, where do you start with people?
Yeah.
So let me close the loop then for just a moment on the Velcro piece, because we referred to it.
The tight junction.
Glyphosate is a direct toxin to the tight junction.
Right.
So the tight junction is that Velcro holding your membrane together. And the gut membrane is so important because it's so massive. You're looking at 2 tennis courts worth of surface area in your body. Compare that to your skin surface area, you're like 8 times larger. So this massive surface area of your gut. And then when that becomes exposed to your environment every time you eat or drink, it's very vulnerable if it's not protected by the gut biome. And so we lost our front line of defense, which was the bacteria, which are the optimal detox machine of the world. We lost that detox machine of the bacteria, and simultaneously we lost their communication network that would maintain that acute inflammatory response to the gut injury. And then we became vulnerable to this direct toxin that induces this injury to the Velcro, and we start to get this unregulated introduction of the outside world into your immune system. Some 70% of your immune system lies within that gut lining. Mm-hmm. Your intestinal membrane, it's pretty stunning to see how vulnerable you are. Your intestinal membrane that could be spread out over those 2 tennis courts is 1 cell layer thick. This is a fraction of 1 hair's width that separates you from the outside world. It's less than cellophane that's protecting you from the outside world, and it's leaking. And so that's this incredible reality of how can we see children as sick as they are? How can we see adults as sick as they are today? It's because we developed this huge permeability to this tiny membrane that protects us from the outside world. And so you're asking them now, how do you take a patient who's born into this environment by C-section, lacking biome, raised on a diet that's micronutrient, has no bacteria, lacking the 5 most important steps of protection to the immune system, and now they're overwhelmed? Where do we begin?
Right.
Step 1 is education, right? And so educate yourself on where the bacteria still live, where are those ecosystems, reconnect yourself with those ecosystems. And like Paige was just mentioning, if you're birthing a baby by C-section, voluntarily or involuntarily, for goodness sakes, as soon as that baby comes out, swab them down with vaginal mucus all over that body, up in their nasal cavities, their ears, like was mentioned, just in the mouth, everywhere. Just swab that baby down, get them covered with mom's good bacteria as quick as possible. You don't want that baby inheriting hospital floor. If you take that baby birthed by C-section, then they get stuck within minutes in some incubator and they're over across in the ICU, that's hospital bacteria they're inheriting. So beat the hospital bacteria, get that baby swabbed down. And it's basically the same story from there until the rest of life. Where would your optimal health be today at your age? Ultimately, it would be outside somewhere, either in the garden or exercising or swimming in the ocean or diving into a river, jumping off a waterfall, mountain biking down a road. These are the ways to get back in touch with that ecosystem, is embrace it. And then for goodness sakes, get into the garden, right? You need to be pulling some weeds. When you pull a weed, there's this huge explosion of earth that happens as that weed emerges from the ground. You just send bacteria and fungi and all kinds of wonderful stuff. You're now breathing it. And who doesn't love the smell of moist soil right after the rain? I mean, we're so rich here in Virginia with this incredible soil and everything else, but no matter where you are in the world, you know that scent of fresh, moist soil that just got gifted by rain. And so that ecosystem is such a rare experience in your life right now if you're the typical human. Most of your life is lived in a cardboard box of drywall, and you then jump into an air-conditioned car, and you drive on pavement to an air-conditioned office and vice versa. And so get out into the ecosystem is step one of rebuilding the foundation of where you became weak. Step two then is, can you turn back the clock 50 million years? And that's the fun thing about this supplement that we've been using is human life has not seen this level of excellence at this communication level. Why do I say that with such confidence? Because we know we lost soil biome when the dinosaurs went extinct. Why did they go extinct? There was some sort of event, probably a meteorite or something, that hit the surface of the earth, suddenly covered the earth with this layer of dust that killed the topsoil. We had a huge die-off of the complexity of the ecosystem. And from that moment forward, everything got smaller. Our plants were smaller. We used to have ferns the size of houses. Now our plants got smaller, the mollusks got smaller, the dinosaurs could never live again. There's no biology, there's no plant on Earth that could support the biology of a brontosaurus right now. We don't have that kind of nutrient density left. And so when we go back 50 million years in the fossil record and pull forward that level of communication, all bets are off on how good life can be. And that's not because it does anything. It restores the dietary supplement we're talking about. And after 5 years of working with this thing, everybody wants to know, well, does it fix this? Or does it fix that? Or does it fix this? And the answer is it fixes nothing. It doesn't do any fixing. Does the cell tower actually fix your cell phone? No, not at all. Your cell phone worked the whole time. And so Restore doesn't fix anything. It doesn't fix disease. It doesn't prevent disease. It doesn't do anything but put the cellular network back into play. And then the cells, your body, in conjunction and communication with the mitochondria inside and the bacteria outside your cells, that system, once the communication is up and running, you've never experienced it before. You've never experienced human health before. That's a pretty cool message because our average lifespan of 78 years right now is pathetically low compared to what our biologic capacity is.
Right, at least half, right?
150, no problem.
Yeah.
Wow. And so we're halfway to good. And the good news is, I think we are in these next years as we start to understand and respect our environment and realize that there are checks and balances built into Mother Nature. If we go and dump 2 billion kilograms, which is how much we dumped last year, 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate on the planet's soils, there's going to be repercussions to human life. We are going to lose generations of children to autism and cancer and many other conditions if we don't start to reconnect to that environment. And if we don't take responsibility for Mother Earth, we will suffer more than she will. She's got checks and balances built in. So when we do kill ourselves out of our idiocy, the cockroaches are going to be fine, Mother Earth's going to recover, and it's going to continue. And so the good news is we're only a self-limited problem. Mother Earth is going to survive us. But the bad news is we are on the brink of extinction. Our children are so sick that by the next 15 years, we could expect to lose the ability to be in reproductive wellness as a species.
Pottinger's cats.
Wow.
So we're right there. We're on it. We're one generation away from collapse if we don't change everything.
These young couples that is my passion to kind of work with these young people getting back to real food and how to maximize their reproductivity. They just have no clue that it's not normal that we have reproductive rates, less than 50% today.
Right.
It seems like it's normal to go to see a fertility doctor, and that's not true. But like you said, let's start moving towards the hope, because one of the things that I love about you is that you're not just looking at fixing my body or your body or Stephen's or any of our listeners. You're looking at Mother Earth. And I really want to talk about how we can take this from our microcosm and into the macrocosm, and we can take this science of, what does it look like, Dr. Bush, going forward with this research and this stuff that you all have been working on. As you mentioned, you and your colleagues, there may be one of those doctors there at UVA that gets a Nobel Prize. We'd sure like to be a part of recommending it, and you as well. So what can we do to help Mother Earth?
Well, before you go there, on the topic of gut health still, for optimal gut health, your product Restore is phenomenal. Paige recommends it. You've got study after study after study and documentation on your site. What else other than the Restore is cycling different probiotics for all the different species you have, or digestive enzymes? What do you recommend for overall optimal gut health, or is Restore the magic bullet for that? What would you say if it was you, your kid?
I would say Restore is your foundation. So getting the communication network in there is your foundation of health.
Yep.
And your next steps are to breathe as many ecosystems as possible, and then start to bring that ecosystem into your cooking and food preparation again. And so a probiotic is inherently a very narrow spectrum of bacteria. You've got maybe 3 species, 7 species in there. And so we've been talking about the problems of monoculture at the big macro level. At the microscopic level, it's no different. Taking 35 billion copies of the same bacteria every day is a bit of a disaster for the word ecodiversity, right? And so remember that your probiotic is a stepping stone at best. And so if you're on a probiotic, I would say no more than 2 weeks at a time. If you got exposed to an antibiotic or chemotherapy or a big GI viral illness and you feel like you need a quick correct, you could throw a probiotic into the system. But keep in mind, the probiotic is a narrow spectrum, very, very microcosm of what the big ecosystem needs to be, and it's not human. It's not from a human source. And so we get all of our probiotics from cow intestines. And so with the slaughter of cows and our meat production, that's where we grow all these bacteria out of that rumen gut. Well, it turns out those rumen bacteria are engineered for a completely different digestive tract than the human. And so all of the probiotics on the market end up just being passed through your system, and they can't set up a balanced and homeostatic ecosystem. And this is why they have such short-lived effect. They're not really setting up a balanced ecosystem. They're just like a Band-Aid that you're throwing on and it's passing through, and the next day you got the same imbalance. And so throw a new foundation in there with Restore, and then look beyond the probiotic. Start saying, where do I get the thousands of species back? And the answer is not from your probiotic or your supplement industry. It's going to be from the air itself. Mm-hmm. Remember fermentation. We fermented food in every single culture on the planet right up until the 1950s when the ice box became normal in households. Right. And so we went from the necessity of fermentation to the luxury of a refrigerator. And suddenly we threw out thousands of years of food preparation and fermentation and said, well, we can just stick a refrigerator pickle in there. It tastes about the same as a pickle. Well, if you've ever had a true fermented dill pickle, you're a lucky person, because that is an extraordinarily exquisite delicacy. Totally different than the vinegar refrigerator pickle that you're pulling off the grocery store shelf today.
Made with table salt.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would invite all of you to jump online and just see how simple it is to make your own sauerkraut. It's literally salt and water. You make a salt water brine, and then you shred your cabbage and throw it in. You're done.
Dr. Bush, that's what I tell my clients. I love to give them these choices, or anybody that, the people that I love, I try and explain. You can buy a bottle of probiotics, and that's fine. Like you say, throw one in here or there. But what you get in your fermented cabbage and your sauerkrauts, and the cost savings is amazing. But what's on one little teaspoon of a sauerkraut is equal to a whole case of what you would buy.
Yes, exactly. The numbers are truly extraordinary. And where did that sauerkraut get the bacteria from? Well, if you go buy your sauerkraut off a typical grocery store shelf, it came from a probiotic. It's 3 species. So if you go in the grocery store and buy a cheap sauerkraut, you're not getting much different than a probiotic. Maybe it's 1 species. Often it's like acidophilus or in your yogurt, whatever one thing they use to ferment it. In contrast, if you go to your health food store and you go to the refrigerator section, you can find wild fermented sauerkraut, and it's like a little bag, and it's like $12. Like $12 for that little package of sauerkraut. But it's that because they took the time to air ferment that that bacterial fermentation. So now they've introduced hundreds and thousands of species of bacteria into that culture, and all of those species are working from different angles on that cabbage to create different micronutrient mix and everything else. So you get this huge biome and huge micronutrient density and diversity that you would not get on a typical kind of probiotic kind of experience. So ferment at home is a huge key to gut health. Yeah. And I would also really turn your attention again to breathing. Just like the sauerkraut that breathes in those thousands of species to ferment itself, you can breathe that same air out in your garden, go to the waterfalls near your home, go to the beach, find the desert, go to as many ecosystems you can find, and you're going to repopulate your ecosystem to match that biodiversity that you live in. If you find your life being very limited in its ecosystem, i.e. living in a drywall and air-conditioned car, your biome is going to equal that. It's going to be very narrow, and it's going to lack the resilience that you'll find when you get reconnected to your greater environment.
And that really kind of brings up on our last Living a Primal Lifestyle show, Nico and I were talking about forest bathing in Japan and how the studies show that they've made that part of Japanese culture, the breathing in the forest. It's like your doctor says, you need to go breathe, 4 times a day. And that the immune system from even one walk through the forest was up 70% or, 700% or some crazy number for 30 days or more. So you're exactly right. That's what's happening. That flora is supporting the immune system, and there we go.
It's beautiful. And it's just such an obvious message in the end, right? Stay in touch with Mother Earth, and she'll protect you. She'll take care of you. She'll nurture you. Reject Mother Earth, insulate yourself away from her, isolate yourself, live in an alone box, and you're not going to do so well.
It's frustrating. This message is, we're still vastly Western medicine society, and this message, it's people get pummeled with antibiotics, and they don't question the doctor. That's just, that's their reverent source that they're going to get their information from, and they're going to get more damage done than good because they're just pumping more and more antibiotics onto a problem without addressing that core. So it's great I'm so fortunate to be able to be near Paige because I get to hear, not only great information, but meet people like you, the biohacks we're coming across, the true health stuff. I was just mentioning the other day to a friend of mine that, he asked me, if you could go back and learn things, what would you do differently? And I'm like, I feel really fortunate that at 49, I'm getting the information that's going to prolong my life way more than most people on planet Earth, not just limited to the conversation we're having today, but all kind of other things. So I'm really fortunate and blessed you're having this conversation with us. And now, Paige, going to segue into what some of the things you're working on to restore Earth back to a place where we want to live, where our children aren't going to lose the ability to reproduce and that kind of thing. I know that you're doing a lot in a lot of the work that you do, and a lot of the money from the work that you do goes into that stuff. So we'd love to.
Yeah, and how can we help?
How we can help. Yeah. What can we do?
Yeah, every time you support the information behind this product, you're supporting the bigger mission. And so we were handed this. I didn't discover it. John didn't discover it. We were handed this incredible gift from Mother Nature. Said, hey, look here. Look at this incredible secret. And that secret of Restore is grace. It is literally biologic grace. You would sit here and dump chemical all over my soils, and you would destroy the surface of my ecosystem. Well, look what I buried 50 million years ago for you. I buried the antidote to your insanity, and I'm loving on you and giving you the opportunity to correct your mistakes and come back. She's inviting us back, and that's what every dollar that comes out of this product, we are channeling back into projects that really change the way industry is done on every level of this nation. And the way in which we want to I can encapsulate that in the shortest amount of time is to tell you it's all about communication again. And so we were handed an extremely exquisite example of biologic cellular communication with Restore. What we feel like there is a responsibility and opportunity to do is turn that into a macro communication system. And so one of our most exciting subsidiaries that this product is funding is an IT platform. It'll be the first social media platform that connects people with idea to idea and passion to passion to really accelerate the rate at which we impact the world through educating each other and by accelerating that with our different talents. And if there's one thing I've learned since stepping out of academia, it's that academia has suffered and is continuing to suffer in its ability to be successful because it is so pillared. It is so narrowed in the way in which it is organized. You have cardiologists that spend their entire 50-year career just talking to cardiologists. And you have oncologists just talking to oncologists. And so they are so isolated from one another. There's such a lack of macro communication going among those, even subspecialties of medicine, let alone if you look at an entire university. The sociologists are never talking to the medical doctors. The language instructors are not talking to the sociologists. There is just utter breakdown of real community.
So from isolation to collaboration.
Yes, and so that's really our passion project right now. And so this social media platform will be launching in the next year. So we will keep in touch with you guys, and you'll be on our list. But if you go to restoreforlife.com, join the newsletter feed there. As all of these new products are hitting, we have an energy company with very exciting sustainable energy things. We have, the IT platform. We've got products for large animals. We're going to really reduce the methane production for greenhouse gases, all kinds of exciting projects. So sign up at restoreforlife.com for more kind of that stream of information and everything else. And just keep in touch, because ultimately this is what's going to heal human species and Mother Earth. Get us back in touch is just, let's talk.
Let's talk.
Yeah, we'll have your bio and all your information in the description of this video below. And we look forward to getting back in touch to do other topics that are focused in one area, because like Paige said, we could talk for hours.
Yes.
And lose everybody, but
I think this was a very informative and easy to understand podcast here, and we appreciate your valuable time, Dr. Zach Bush.
Well, we appreciate your effort to educate the community at large, and it makes my job very rewarding, because as an isolated doctor, I'd be very ineffective at changing the world, and it takes people with a real passion for education and mission like you guys have to bring that out. So thank you for having us on, and very excited to keep that conversation going.
Awesome. So to optimal health and peak performance.
That's right. We'll talk again soon.
Signing out. Thank you very much, Dr. Bush. Appreciate you.
Thanks for all the listeners joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.